The year of preparation passed faster than anyone expected, filled with frantic activity as engineer Park Yuna and her growing team of human and alien technicians worked to integrate the ancestral weapon systems into every ship the assembly could muster. Ambassador Yoon Sira had become something she never imagined possible, a voice that the entire galaxy listened to when she spoke, and she used that influence to forge alliances that would have been unthinkable just 12 months before. Captain Moon Tayson now commanded a joint fleet of vessels from every species in the assembly, a position that would have been laughable before the discovery of humanity's ancient heritage. But the senior civilizations had learned to respect human military thinking in the months of war games and tactical planning. Dr. Beek Jinho had unlocked more secrets from the ancestral vessels database, revealing histories that rewrote the textbooks of a dozen civilizations, and his translations had become required reading for diplomats and scientists across the galaxy. The day the hunger arrived came 3 months earlier than predicted. Announced by sensor readings that made fleet commanders across the assembly pale with terror, Sira stood on the bridge of the ancestral vessel, now designated as the flagship of the Combined Defense Force, and watched through the main display as something darker than space itself emerged from the void between stars. The hunger was not a ship or a creature in any conventional sense, but rather an absence-given form, a tear in reality that consumed light and matter and energy, growing larger with every passing moment. All fleet elements report ready, Tayson announced from her command station. Weapon systems are charged and awaiting neural link activation. Sira looked at the interface chair that sat at the center of the bridge, designed for human neural patterns and deadly to anyone else who attempted to use it. And she knew what she had to do. The initial volleys will be conventional weapons, she ordered. We need to understand how it responds before we commit our primary systems. The assembly fleet opened fire with everything they had. Energy beams and missiles and weapons that represented the pinnacle of galactic technology. And Sira watched as every attack simply vanished into the hunger's darkness without effect. Conventional weapons confirmed ineffective, Jinho reported from his station. The hunger is accelerating toward the fleet. Sira moved toward the interface chair, but Tayson stepped into her path with concern evident in her eyes. Ambassador, let me do this, Tayson said. You are too important to risk. The weapon requires more than just a human mind, Sira replied. It requires someone who understands what we are fighting for. And I have spent the last year learning exactly that. She settled into the chair and felt the neural connections establish themselves, reaching into her mind with tendrils of ancient technology that recognized her as a child of the ancestors who had built this vessel. The sensation was overwhelming at first, like being connected to every star in the galaxy simultaneously. But Sira focused on her purpose and felt the weapon systems respond to her will. Activating primary weapon, she announced. Though her voice sounded distant, even to her own ears, energy surged through the ancestral vessel and broadcast outward on frequencies that no instrument could measure, patterns that spoke in a language older than words. And the hunger recoiled as if struck by a physical blow, direct impact confirmed. Jinho called out with excitement breaking through his professional composure. The hunger is destabilizing, but Sira could feel something that the sensors could not detect. A presence within the darkness that was far more than mindless hunger. And she realized that they had been wrong about the nature of their enemy. It is not attacking, she said, her voice carrying across the fleet communication network. It is searching. Through the neural link, Sira reached out toward the hunger with something other than weapons, offering communication instead of destruction. And she felt surprise ripple through the entity's vast consciousness. Images flooded her mind. Memories that belonged to the hunger itself, showing a time before it became what it was now. When it had been a civilization of beings who made a terrible mistake and were transformed into an eternal prison of consuming darkness. They were trying to escape death. Sira reported to the fleet. They found a way to live forever, but it changed them into something that could only survive by consuming others. Can we reason with it? Trevax asked through the communication channel. Sira focused her thoughts through the weapon systems, not attacking but speaking in the only language the hunger could understand. And she told it about the ancestors who had fled Earth, about the children who had inherited their mission, about a galaxy that did not want war but would fight to survive. The hunger's response came as emotions rather than words. Ancient regret mixed with endless hunger, and Sira understood that the entity had long forgotten why it consumed, only that it must continue or cease to exist. There is no reasoning with it, she admitted. But I can give it what it has been searching for. She activated the weapon systems at full power, not to destroy but to offer, broadcasting frequencies that resonated with the original nature of the beings trapped within the hunger's darkness. What are you doing? Tayson demanded. I am giving them a choice, Sira replied. The ancestors built these weapons to fight, but they also built them to heal. And the hunger is made of beings who have suffered for millions of years. The darkness began to change, fragments of light appearing within its depths as individual consciousnesses responded to Sira's offer. And the hunger shuddered as something fundamental shifted within its nature. They are separating, Jinho reported with awe in his voice. The entity is breaking apart. Sira maintained the broadcast even as the effort drained her strength. And she watched through the neural link as millions of minds that had been merged into a nightmare of endless consumption finally found the peace they had been denied for so long. The hunger did not explode or disappear, but rather faded like a shadow exposed to dawn. Its constituent beings finally released from the prison their ancestors had created, and when the darkness cleared, the stars shone brighter than before. Sira disconnected from the interface chair and nearly collapsed. But Tayson was there to catch her and ease her into a proper seat. It is done, Sira said weakly. They are free. The assembly fleet maintained position as communication channels filled with celebrations from every species. And Sira watched through tired eyes as beings who had been enemies just a year ago congratulated each other on their shared survival. Travax's image appeared on the main display, and the High Counselor bowed his head in a gesture of respect that the Dominion had not shown to another species in recorded history. The assembly owes its existence to humanity, Travax said, and we will never forget what you have done. Sira smiled despite her exhaustion. We did not do this alone, High Counselor. And that is exactly the point. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy transformed in ways that the ancestors could only have dreamed about, with humanity taking its place among the senior species, not through conquest or age, but through proving that the youngest civilization had wisdom the oldest ones had forgotten. Ambassador Yun Sierra returned to Earth as a hero. But she quickly reminded everyone who would listen that heroes were not individuals, but communities that chose to stand together when darkness threatened. The ancestral vessel remained in orbit around the assembly station, a reminder of where humanity had come from and what they had become. And Dr. Baek Jinho continued to unlock its secrets while searching for the other 11 ships that the ancestors had launched so long ago. Captain Moon Tayson was promoted to Fleet Admiral, the first human to hold such rank in the assembly military, and she began training a new generation of officers who would carry humanity's legacy forward. Engineer Park Yuna established a research institute dedicated to understanding and improving the ancestral technology, ensuring that the weapons of war could become tools of peace. And somewhere in the vast darkness between galaxies, the freed consciousnesses that had once been the hunger traveled toward destinies they finally had the freedom to choose. The children of Earth had found their place among the stars, and their story was only beginning. The holographic ancestor stood before them like a ghost from humanity's forgotten past. And Ambassador Yunsira felt the weight of 10,000 years pressing down upon her shoulders as she waited for explanations that would reshape everything the galaxy believed. "Show us," Sira requested. "Show us what drove our ancestors from Earth." The chamber transformed around them once more, projecting images that made even the hardened Captain Moon Tayson take a step backward in alarm. A darkness moved between the stars. Not empty space, but something alive and hungry, consuming everything it touched and growing larger with every world it devoured. "We called it the Void Hunger," the ancestor explained. "It swept through the galaxy long before any of your assembly species achieved spaceflight, destroying civilizations that had flourished for millions of years." High Counselor Trevax stepped forward, his composure finally cracking. "There is no record of such an entity in our histories. Your histories begin after the hunger passed through this region of space," the ancestor replied. "The civilizations that existed before were erased so completely that not even ruins remained to tell their stories." Dr. Baek Jinho was recording everything, his academic training keeping his hands steady even as fear clouded his eyes. How did humanity survive? "Earth was hidden," the ancestor said, "a backwater world in an unremarkable system, passed over by the hunger as it pursued greater prey. But our seers foresaw that the hunger would return one day to finish what it started. The projection showed ancient humans, building great vessels in secret, working with technology that seemed impossible for their era. And Sira realized that her ancestors had achieved spaceflight and then deliberately abandoned it. We launched 12 ships to different corners of the galaxy," the ancestor continued, "each carrying the seeds of humanity and the weapons we had developed to fight the hunger. This vessel is one of those 12, Engineer Park Yuna observed, her technical mind already analyzing the systems around them. "Correct," the ancestor confirmed. "We were meant to establish a colony and prepare for the day when the hunger returned. But our journey took longer than anticipated, and the cold sleep claimed us before we could complete our mission." Sira looked at the rows of preservation pods, seeing thousands of her ancestors who had sacrificed everything to give humanity a chance at survival. "The ship continued without them. I am programmed with their knowledge and their purpose," the holographic figure said. "For 300 years, I watched the species of this assembly grow and spread, waiting for humanity to join them, and when your people finally reached the stars, I knew the time had come." The Mandari observer pulsed with anxious colors. "You said the threat is returning, but how can you know this after so long?" The ancestor gestured, and new projections appeared showing sensor data that made the alien observers gasp with recognition. "My long-range sensors detected the hunger 6 months ago," the ancestor explained. "It has been traveling through empty space, but it has now turned toward the populated regions of the galaxy. How long do we have?" Tayson asked, her military mind already calculating defensive strategies. 1 year, the ancestor replied. "Perhaps less if it accelerates." Trevax turned to Sira with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that looked almost like respect. "Your ancestors built weapons against this entity?" "We built the only weapons that ever proved effective," the holographic figure answered, "that they can only be operated by humans." "Why?" Vethros demanded, his earlier hostility replaced by desperate curiosity. The ancestor smiled sadly. "Because we trusted no one else, ambassador of the Kalari, and because the weapons require a connection that only human minds can provide." The projection shifted to show the technological heart of the vessel, systems of incredible complexity that hummed with power waiting to be unleashed. And Sira saw interfaces designed specifically for human neural patterns. The weapons broadcast on frequencies that disrupt the hunger structure, the ancestor explained. But targeting requires a living human mind to guide the signal. and the feedback would destroy any other species that attempted the connection. Park Yuna studied the systems with growing understanding. Can this technology be adapted to our modern ships? It must be, the ancestor said. This vessel alone cannot defeat the hunger. But if you can integrate these systems into your assembly fleet, you might stand a chance. The following hours became a whirlwind of activity as Park Yuna worked with the ship's systems while Jinho documented everything they learned. And Sira found herself in constant communication with both Earth's government and the Assembly Council. The alien observers reported back to their respective governments, and Sira watched through communication channels as the news spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The youngest species in the assembly had just become the most important, and the senior civilizations that had dismissed humanity for 40 years were now forced to acknowledge that their survival depended on the very beings they had treated as children. Travax approached Sira as she stood before the preservation pods, paying silent respect to ancestors she had never known existed. Ambassador Yoon, he said, his voice carrying none of the condescension that had defined their previous interactions. The Assembly owes humanity an apology. Sira turned to face him. We do not want apologies, High Counselor. We want partnership. You shall have it, Travax promised. Whatever resources the Dominion possesses are at your disposal. Then help us spread this technology to every ship in the fleet, Sira replied. Because when the hunger arrives, we will meet everyone standing together. The ancestors' hologram appeared beside them. Your ancestors will be proud, Yunsera. For this is exactly what they hoped would happen. What do you mean? Sira asked. They knew that one day, humanity would have to lead the galaxy against the darkness, the ancestor said. They believed that the hardship of Earth would forge a species strong enough to unite others in the face of extinction. Sira looked at the alien dignitaries who were now listening to human engineers explain technology that predated their civilizations, and she understood that the universe was far stranger and more connected than anyone had ever imagined. The children of Earth had finally learned who they were, and now they had to become who they were meant to be. The hunger was coming, and humanity would be waiting. The Grand Chamber had never been so silent as it was in the moment after the ancient vessel stopped moving. And Ambassador Yoon Sira felt the weight of every alien gaze upon her as she stood at the central podium where no human had ever stood before. High Counselor Travax rose from his seat, his forearms folded in a posture that Sarah had learned to recognize as deep uncertainty. The vessel has acknowledged your transmission, Ambassador Yoon. So it would seem, Sira replied, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. This changes nothing regarding security protocols, Vethros interjected, his reptilian eyes narrow with suspicion. We cannot assume peaceful intent based on a single response. The Mendari representative pulsed with colors that indicated disagreement. The vessel had 300 years to attack us and chose silence instead, which suggests it was never interested in war. Debates erupted across the chamber as delegates processed the implications of humanity's connection to the mysterious ship. And Sira observed the subtle shifts in how they looked at her now, where once she had seen dismissal and condescension. She now detected something closer to wariness, as if the senior species were suddenly uncertain about everything they thought they knew about the young civilization from Earth. A communication alert silenced the chamber, and the holographic display flickered to life with a new transmission from the vessel. The message was longer this time, filled with the strange language that had confounded the Assembly's translation systems. But Sira recognized the patterns from her work with Jinho. The ancestors request to speak with their children. She translated for the Assembly. They are opening a docking port and inviting us to board. Travax stepped forward with alarm evident in his posture. This could be a trap. It can also be the most important first contact in galactic history, Sira countered. And the message is clear that they will only accept human visitors. Unacceptable, Bethros declared. Any expedition must include assembly representatives. The next transmission arrived before Sarah could respond. And as she read the translated words, she felt a chill run through her body. The children may bring witnesses if they wish, but only human hands may touch the sacred controls, and only human eyes may see the inner sanctum. The assembly debated for hours about conditions and security measures and diplomatic protocols, but in the end, they had no choice but to accept the terms offered by a vessel that could destroy their combined fleets without effort. Sira assembled her team in the human delegation's quarters. Looking at the faces of people who had volunteered for a mission that might not allow them to return, Dr. Beek Jinho stood ready with translation equipment and recording devices. His fear evident but controlled by academic curiosity that burned brighter than self-preservation. Captain Moon Tasson commanded the small security detail, her military training evident in every precise movement. Though she had admitted privately to Sarah that nothing in her experience had prepared her for this situation, Engineer Park Yuna rounded out the team. Selected for her expertise in xenotechnology that might prove useful aboard a vessel built with science beyond anything the galaxy had seen. The assembly is sending 3 observers, Sira informed them. High Counselor Travax insists on accompanying us personally, along with representatives from the Kalari and Mendari. Tayson frowned. Can we trust them not to interfere? We have no choice, Sira replied. But the vessel's terms were clear, and the ancestors will deal with anyone who violates their hospitality. The shuttle launch felt surreal, like crossing a threshold between the known and the impossible. And Sira watched through the viewport as the massive form of the ancestral vessel grew larger until it filled her entire field of vision. Symbols covered every surface of the hull, writing that had been ancient when the pyramids were young. And Sira traced the familiar shapes with her eyes while her heart pounded with anticipation. The docking port opened like a flower greeting the dawn, revealing a passage lit with soft golden light that seemed to welcome them home. And the shuttle entered smoothly, as if guided by invisible hands. Gravity returned the moment they stepped off the shuttle, adjusted perfectly for human comfort. And Sira noticed that Trevax and the other alien observers had to activate their personal gravity compensators to move comfortably. The vessel knows the difference between us, Jinho observed quietly. It is designed for humans. They walked through corridors decorated with artwork that made Sira's breath catch in her throat. Paintings and sculptures depicting scenes from an Earth that existed before recorded history. Animals that had been extinct for 10,000 years ran across painted savannas, and humans who looked almost identical to modern people stood beneath unfamiliar constellations, reaching toward stars that called them home. Magnificent, the Mandari observer whispered through their translator. This artwork predates our oldest surviving cultural artifacts. Travax remained silent, but Sira could see the effect this discovery was having on the High Counselor. As every step they took deeper into the vessel challenged everything the Dominion believed about their place in galactic history, the inner sanctum opened before them after what felt like hours of walking, revealing a chamber so vast that Sira could not see its far walls, filled with equipment that hummed with power that had waited 10,000 years for this moment. And there, arranged in rows that stretched beyond sight, stood preservation pods containing the bodies of the ancestors. Sira approached the nearest pod with trembling steps, looking down at the face of a woman who might have been her own distant grandmother, preserved in perfect sleep that had long since become death. They did not survive the journey, Jinho said softly, his voice thick with emotion. The stasis technology failed at some point, perhaps centuries ago, but their ship remembered its mission, Tayson added. It waited for us even after they were gone. A holographic figure materialized before them, taking the form of an elderly man wearing clothing that matched the ancient artwork on the walls. And when he spoke, his words were in the ancestral language that Jinho had worked so hard to reconstruct. "Welcome, children of Earth," the figure said. "I am the voice of those who came before, preserved in light when flesh could no longer endure." Sira stepped forward. "We have so many questions, and I have answers," the ancestor replied. "But first you must understand why we left our home, and why we waited so long for you to find us." The holographic figure raised one hand, and the chamber transformed around them, showing visions of an Earth that existed before the Ice Ages. When humanity first learned that they were not alone in the universe, we left because something was coming, the ancestor explained. Something that would have destroyed us all. And we scattered across the galaxy, hoping that some branch of our family would survive to remember who we were. Sira felt cold dread settling in her stomach. Is it still coming? The ancestor's expression grew grave. It is returning, children, and only you can stop it. The chamber fell silent as humans and aliens alike struggled to comprehend what they had just heard. And Sira understood that humanity's role in the galaxy was about to change forever. 3 days had passed since the ancient vessel began its slow approach toward assembly space, and the gleaming corridors of the station had transformed from places of diplomatic courtesy into passages filled with fear and suspicion. Ambassador Yoon Sera had barely slept in those 3 days, spending every available hour in the small research laboratory that served Earth's delegation, listening to the mysterious transmission again and again until the sounds began to haunt her dreams. Dr. Baek Jinho, Earth's senior xenolinguist, sat across from her with dark circles under his eyes that matched her own, his fingers moving across holographic displays as he analyzed the transmission using every tool at his disposal. The Assembly's translation systems are looking for matches with known galactic languages, Jinho explained, his voice rough from exhaustion. But I have been approaching this differently. Sira leaned forward in her chair. What have you found? Jinho pulled up a comparison display that showed the audio waveform of the transmission alongside several other patterns. These are recordings of reconstructed Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor language that gave birth to most of Earth's major language families thousands of years ago. The patterns on the display showed similarities that even Sarah's untrained eye could recognize. Rhythms and structures that seemed to echo each other across an impossible gulf of time and space. That cannot be coincidence. Sira breathed, feeling her heart begin to race. There is more, Jinho continued, bringing up images of the symbols covering the vessel's hull. I compared these markings to our archives of ancient human writing systems, and I found matches with Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and symbols found in prehistoric cave paintings across Earth. Sira stared at the evidence before her, struggling to accept what it seemed to suggest, because the implications were too enormous to process easily. Are you saying this vessel came from Earth? She asked. Jinho nodded slowly. I believe this ship was built by humans, or rather by our ancestors, thousands of years before recorded history began on Earth. The room fell silent as both of them contemplated the weight of this discovery, and Sira found herself looking at the holographic image of the vessel with new eyes. All her life, she had grown up believing that humanity was young and alone in the universe, a species that had only recently stumbled into a galaxy filled with ancient civilizations. But now evidence suggested that humans had reached for the stars before they learned to write. Can you translate the message? Sira asked. Jinho worked his displays for several minutes, his brow furrowed in concentration. The language has evolved over millennia, and I can only reconstruct fragments, but I believe the core message is a question. He played a modified version of the transmission with his reconstruction overlaid, and Sira heard words that sent chills down her spine. Do the children still remember? Jinho translated, his voice barely above a whisper. Sira stood and walked to the window. looking out at the distant stars. Someone left Earth thousands of years ago, and they have been waiting all this time for their descendants to find them. The assembly needs to know about this. Jinho said. Not yet, Sira replied, her mind racing through the political implications. If we bring this to the assembly now, they will take over the investigation and push humanity aside as they always do. She turned to face Jinho, with determination hardening her features. This is our heritage, our history, and we have the right to understand it before we share it with species who have spent 40 years treating us like children. Jinho looked uncertain. What do you propose? I need you to reconstruct enough of the ancestral language to send a response, Sira said. If that vessel is waiting for humanity's children to answer, then humanity's children will answer. The following hours became a blur of frantic work as Jinho pieced together linguistic fragments while Sira coordinated with Earth's government through encrypted channels. And the small human delegation operated in secret while the assembly continued its war preparations. By the time Sira returned to the Grand Chamber for the next session, she carried knowledge that would shake the foundations of galactic understanding. And she found the senior species still arguing about fleet positions and weapon deployments. High Counselor Trevax called the session to order. The unknown vessel continues its approach and maintains silence despite our repeated attempts at communication. Then we must strike first, Vethros urged, his scales now permanently fixed in aggressive colors. Every hour we wait gives the enemy more time to prepare. Striking blindly would be foolish, countered the Mandari representative. We do not know what defenses that vessel possesses, Sarah stood, drawing surprised looks from delegates who had not expected the human ambassador to participate. High Counselor, I request permission to address the assembly regarding the unknown vessel. Trevax regarded her with barely concealed impatience. Ambassador Yoon, we are discussing military matters that require experienced perspectives. With respect. High Counselor, I believe I have information that will change this discussion entirely, Sira replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. Something in her tone must have conveyed the seriousness of her claim, because Trevax gestured for her to proceed, and Sira walked to the central podium where she had never been permitted to stand. She activated the display systems and showed the assembly the same evidence that had convinced her. The linguistic analysis and the symbol comparisons and the translation of the vessel's message murmurs spread through the chamber as the implications became clear. And Sira watched ancient civilizations struggle to accept that the youngest species among them might have roots deeper than their own. The vessel is asking if the children still remember, Sira concluded. It has been waiting for humanity, and Earth claims the right to respond to its own ancestors. The chamber erupted into chaos, with delegates shouting objections and demanding verification. And Sira stood at the center of the storm, with the calm certainty of someone who finally understood her place in the universe. High Counselor Trevax raised his forearms for silence, his expression troubled in ways Sira had never seen. This is an extraordinary claim. Ambassador Yoon, it is an extraordinary truth, Sira replied. And humanity will not be pushed aside while others decide the fate of our own legacy. The vote that followed was contentious, but fear of the unknown vessel ultimately outweighed prejudice against the young species, and the assembly granted Earth permission to send a response. Sira worked with Jinho to craft a message using the reconstructed ancestral language. Simple words that carried the weight of 10,000 years. The children remember, the message said. The children are here. The transmission went out across the void, and the entire galaxy held its breath 3 hours later. The ancient vessel stopped moving. The ancestors had heard their children's voice, and now they were ready to speak. The massive space station hung in the void like a crown of metal and light, spinning slowly against the backdrop of 1,000 distant stars. and within its gleaming halls, representatives from 12 spacefaring civilizations had gathered for what should have been another routine day of diplomatic proceedings. Ambassador Yoon Sera stood near the observation window of the human delegation's modest quarters, watching cargo ships drift between the station's docking arms. And she could not help but feel small in this place, where humanity remained a footnote in galactic politics. 40 years had passed since Earth made first contact with the Galactic Assembly, and in that time, humans had earned little more than polite tolerance from species that had sailed between stars for thousands of years before humanity learned to make fire. The quarters assigned to Earth's delegation were cramped and positioned far from the central chambers, where real decisions were made. But Sera had learned to accept such slights with grace, knowing that respect had to be earned rather than demanded. Her assistant, a young man named Cho Min-woo, rushed into the room with panic written across his face, and Sera turned to face him with concern rising in her chest. "Ambassador, you need to see this," Min-woo said, his voice trembling as he activated the holographic display in the center of the room. The image that appeared showed a vessel unlike anything Sera had seen in her years of diplomatic service. A ship so massive that the scale indicators seemed almost absurd, stretching nearly 50 kilometers from bow to stern. "The Assembly is calling an emergency session," Min-woo continued. "The unknown vessel has activated after 300 years of silence." Sera knew about this ship, as every species in the Assembly did, because it had become something of a legend in galactic circles. A mystery that no civilization had ever solved despite centuries of trying. The vessel had drifted at the edge of Assembly-controlled space since before humanity took its first steps toward the stars, covered in writing that no translation system could decode, ignoring every attempt at communication, as if the entire galaxy were beneath its notice. Scientists had studied it from a distance. Philosophers had debated its origins, and religious movements had formed around its silent presence. But the ship had never responded to anything or anyone, until now. Sera moved quickly through the station's corridors, joining the stream of diplomats flowing toward the grand chamber. And she could feel the fear radiating from beings who had never known uncertainty in their long galactic histories. The Vorath delegation passed her without acknowledgement, their tall insectoid forms clicking with agitation, and the Mandari representatives floated by on their gravity platforms, their gelatinous bodies pulsing with colors that indicated extreme distress. When Sera entered the grand chamber, she found chaos unlike anything she had witnessed in her 5 years as Earth's ambassador, with voices overlapping in a dozen languages as the translation system struggled to keep pace. High Counselor Trevax of the Dominion, the oldest and most powerful species in the Assembly, stood at the central podium, attempting to restore order, his forearms raised in a gesture demanding silence. "The vessel's power readings exceed our combined fleet capacity by a factor of 30, Trevax announced once the chamber finally quieted. "It has altered course and is now moving directly toward Assembly space." Murmurs of terror rippled through the gathered delegates, and Sera watched as beings who had always seemed so confident and superior began to show cracks in their composure. "We must prepare for war," declared Ambassador Vethros of the Kalari Confederacy, his reptilian scales shifting to an aggressive red. "We cannot allow this unknown threat to reach our worlds." "War against what?" countered the Mandari representative, their voice bubbling through their translation device. "We do not even know what we face, and our weapons may be useless against technology of this magnitude." Sera raised her hand to speak, following the proper protocols she had memorized during her training. But Trevax's gaze passed over her as if she were invisible, and her hand slowly lowered as the senior species continued their debate without acknowledging humanity's presence. This was nothing new, and Sera had grown accustomed to being overlooked in chambers where human concerns ranked below supply logistics and trade disputes. But something about this situation felt different. She studied the holographic image of the vessel that floated above the chamber center, noting the strange symbols covering its hull, and a peculiar feeling stirred in her mind that she could not quite identify. "We have received a transmission," announced a technician from the communication station, and the entire chamber fell silent as every being turned toward the new development. The transmission played through the chamber speakers, a sequence of sounds that seemed almost like language but matched nothing in the assembly's vast linguistic databases. And Sierra listened with growing intensity as something about the rhythm and cadence triggered a sensation she could not explain. "Analysis confirms no match to any known language," the technician reported. "The message remains untranslatable." High Counselor Trevax nodded gravely. "Then we must assume hostile intent and prepare our defenses accordingly. With respect, High Counselor." Sierra finally spoke, her voice cutting through the chamber despite its relative softness. "Should we not attempt further communication before assuming the worst?" Trevax turned his attention to her with the patient condescension one might show a child speaking out of turn. "Ambassador Yoon, the Assembly appreciates humanity's optimism. But this is a matter for species with experience in such crises. Humanity has experience with encountering the unknown." Sierra pressed, refusing to be dismissed. "Our entire history is defined by facing threats we did not understand and finding ways to survive. Your species has been spacefaring for less than a century." Vethros interjected with a dismissive hiss. "What could you possibly offer to this discussion?" Sierra felt the weight of 100 alien gazes upon her, all of them expecting her to accept her place and fall silent. But the strange feeling that had begun when she heard the transmission only grew stronger. "I offer the perspective of a species that does not assume everything unknown must be an enemy," Sierra replied. "Humanity has learned that fear often blinds us to possibilities that courage might reveal." Trevax waved one of his 4 hands in dismissal. "Note the human ambassador's comments for the record, and let us proceed with defensive preparations." Sierra returned to her seat among the minor delegations, watching as the senior species argued about fleet formations and defensive perimeters. And she could not shake the feeling that everyone in this chamber was missing something important. She requested a copy of the transmission recording, and though her request was granted with obvious reluctance, Sierra knew that she would spend the coming hours studying every second of that mysterious message. As the emergency session continued around her, Ambassador Yoon Sierra stared at the holographic image of the ancient vessel, and somewhere deep in her mind, a voice she did not recognize seemed to whisper that this ship had been waiting not for the Assembly, but for humanity. The vessel hung in space like a question no one knew how to ask. And Sierra understood that the answer would change everything. The galaxy thought it knew about the youngest species to join their ranks.